My wife moved in with the guy next door for an entire month to figure out her feelings. She assumed I'd be patiently waiting for her to come back. But instead, I made one decision that flipped her entire reality on its head. My name's Mike. I'm 31 years old, and until recently, I genuinely believed I had life all mapped out. I'm not someone who ever chased fame or fortune. I never cared about flashy cars or climbing some corporate ladder. I've always been that simple, steady guy, the type who enjoys a peaceful night over a wild party, who prefers a routine to chaos. I have a dependable job as a software developer, a modest but comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, and I was married to someone I truly believed was the love of my life. Her name is Laura. We met nearly 8 years ago, though now that chapter feels like it happened in another lifetime. Back then, I was a 23-year-old fresh out of college, just trying to find my footing in the real world. It was my first job. I barely knew how to dress for an office, let alone how to handle taxes or relationships. Laura was 22, working as an assistant at a marketing firm. She said she was still exploring her career options, though for the record, she never quite settled into anything. Eventually, she became a full-time stay-at-home wife. We met at one of those casual weekend barbecues. A mutual friend had thrown it together. Nothing fancy, plastic cups, folding chairs, and someone always burning the burgers. I was standing by the grill, awkwardly trying to escape small talk, when she walked up and cracked a sarcastic joke about how I looked like I was planning my escape route. I don't even remember what I said in return, but she laughed. And just like that, the rest of the evening disappeared in conversation. From that moment on, everything between us moved fast. We started dating almost immediately. She had this magnetic energy, a boldness that pulled me in. Laura lived for spontaneity. She was always dragging me out of my comfort zone. One weekend, it'd be a last-minute road trip to the mountains. Next, she'd have us eating at some bizarre new food truck because she'd read about it online. I was the exact opposite, cautious, methodical, always double-checking the route, the budget, the weather. Somehow we made it work. She brought fire and excitement to my otherwise grounded, predictable world. I gave her the kind of stability she said she'd never found in previous relationships. After 3 years of dating, we got married. Nothing extravagant, just a small ceremony with close friends and family. Neither of us came from money, so there was no fairy tale venue or gourmet catering, but that didn't matter to us back then. It felt right. We bought a modest 2-bedroom house in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. Not the biggest place on the block, but it had character and potential, and most of all, it was ours. Our own little corner of the world where we could build something together. Day-to-day life settled into a rhythm. I'd go to work, come home, and find Laura either lounging on the couch or puttering around in the kitchen. At the time, she was still working in marketing, and she always had stories about clients, co-workers, and endless drama. She was the talker. I was the listener. That dynamic worked for us. We didn't have kids, but that was a mutual decision. We agreed to wait until we felt more financially secure and emotionally ready. At least, that's what we told ourselves. Looking back now, I think I got too comfortable, mistaking routine for happiness. Life felt stable, but stability has a way of blinding you to the cracks forming beneath the surface. Our date nights became less frequent. I stopped noticing how much Laura needed to be the center of attention, how she lit up when people noticed her. I assumed that sparkle in her eyes would always be there. For me. I wasn't paying attention. Our fights were rarely explosive, just minor frustrations. The trash not taken out, her shoes left scattered across the hallway. Things every couple argues about. But there's a subtle kind of erosion in a relationship, the kind you don't see until one day you realize part of your foundation is missing. That slow decay had already started, even if I didn't know it at the time. Then, 2 years ago, a new face moved in next door. His name was Jake. Our older neighbors had sold their home and moved down to Florida, and in their place came this guy who looked like he belonged on a magazine cover. Jake was about 28, young, fit, confident, and always shirtless. No exaggeration. Whether he was mowing the lawn, washing his car, or setting up what looked like a home gym in his backyard, He made sure to give the neighborhood a full view of his chiseled physique. It wasn't long before Jake became the unspoken centerpiece of suburban gossip. Every time someone hosted a gathering, he'd somehow become the main topic, sometimes admired, sometimes mocked, but always noticed. Laura? She noticed him the moment he moved in. I could tell. I pretended not to care. We officially met Jake one Saturday morning while working on our front yard. He walked over, friendly as ever, introduced himself, and offered help if we ever needed anything. Laura smiled wider than I'd seen in months. Over the next several weeks, Jake became a more common presence in our lives. He'd wave whenever he saw us, sometimes stop by with small favors, like offering to help fix a squeaky gate or lend a tool. I started to notice how Laura's demeanor shifted around him. Her laugh got louder, and her hair always seemed a little more styled when he was around. She started working out again, something she hadn't done in years. She said it was just for her health. I wanted to believe it. One day she sat me down with a serious look on her face. That's when she dropped the bomb. She said she needed space, that she was confused. She didn't know who she was anymore and needed time to reconnect with herself. And she thought the best way to do that was by staying at Jake's place. Not permanently, just for a month. My brain short-circuited. My wife, my partner of 8 years, was suggesting she move in with the guy next door. For clarity. For reflection. She swore it wasn't about him. He just has a guest room, she said. It's not like that. I should have said no. I should have fought back. But I didn't. I let her go. She packed a bag that night. I watched her walk out our front door and cross the lawn. Jake was waiting. She thought I'd wait, that I'd sit there in the same quiet routine, hoping she'd come back. She had no idea what I was planning next. Jake had that effortless charm, the kind that made people instantly comfortable around him. The moment he approached us that Saturday, Laura struck up a conversation like she'd known him for years. Within minutes, she was asking where he was from, what kind of work he did, and how he liked the neighborhood. I stood there beside her, offering the occasional polite smile and nod, barely getting a word in. It was like watching two old friends reconnect, not two strangers exchanging pleasantries. At the time, it didn't raise any red flags. Laura was naturally sociable. She'd strike up conversations with the mail carrier, the barista at the coffee shop, even random people in line at the grocery store. It was just who she was. Friendly, warm, always quick with a question and a laugh. So her interest in Jake didn't strike me as unusual. If anything, I was glad we were being neighborly. But hindsight has a way of drawing sharp lines around the details you missed. It started subtly. Every time Jake was outside, Laura somehow had a reason to be out there too. Sometimes she'd step out to grab the mail. Other times it was to water the plants, even though we'd just had rain the night before. Once she took out the trash at a time she never usually did. These quick tasks would stretch into 10, sometimes 15-minute conversations with Jake over the fence or in the driveway. One evening, I pulled into the driveway after work and saw them talking. Laura had a basket of laundry in her arms, apparently on her way to the garage, and Jake was leaning casually against the hood of his car, laughing at something she'd said. When I walked up, they both looked my way. Laura smiled like everything was perfectly normal. Jake was just telling me about his new gym setup, she said breezily. Her tone was light, casual, like there was nothing even worth noting. But that wasn't the last time. A couple of weeks later, Laura decided to bake cookies. That in itself wasn't strange, but she hadn't done it in months. She used to enjoy baking when we first moved in, but that phase had long passed. Still, there she was, pulling a tray of cookies out of the oven and plating them carefully. When I asked who they were for, she simply said, "Just being neighborly," and walked across the lawn with the plate in hand, straight to Jake's door. I shrugged it off. Laura had done similar things before. She once made brownies for the family 2 doors down when their daughter graduated. She liked gestures like that, but the timing, the context, it felt different. Then came the workout clothes. One afternoon, she came home with a bag from a boutique she usually avoided for being too flashy. Inside were bright, form-fitting leggings and a matching sports top, not her usual style. When I asked about it, she told me she was planning to start jogging again, said she wanted to get back into shape. And sure, Laura had gone through fitness spurts before, enthusiastic for a few weeks, then quietly giving up. But this time, the timing couldn't have been more on the nose. Jake jogged nearly every morning. I'd see him making laps around the block, earbuds in, moving with the kind of confidence that draws glances. And suddenly Laura decided her fitness journey would start around the same hour he was out there. The overlap didn't feel like a coincidence. One morning, I was heading out for work and caught them talking again. Laura was stretching on the sidewalk while Jake stood beside her, demonstrating some technique for avoiding shin splints. She laughed at something he said and nodded along, and when she noticed me, she smiled and waved. I waved back, got in my car, and drove off. But my thoughts stayed with that moment. Something about it stuck in my mind and refused to let go. Around this time, I started noticing changes in her phone habits too. Laura had always been glued to her phone, scrolling social media, chatting with friends. But now, there was a guardedness. She'd quickly lock the screen or flip her phone over when I entered the room. More than once, I caught a glimpse of Jake's name at the top of her screen, usually while she was on Instagram. She'd swipe past it like she didn't want me to see, but I'd already seen enough. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off with a wave. "He posts workout tips," she said. "They're actually helpful." I nodded, pretending to believe her, but the unease inside me was growing. Then there was the laughter. One weekend I was working in the garage, organizing shelves, when I heard laughter from the backyard. I stepped out to find Laura standing near the fence with a glass of iced tea, and Jake was on the other side, gesturing animatedly as he told some story. They were laughing like old friends at a reunion. When Laura saw me, she waved and said Jake had just shared something funny that happened at the gym. I nodded, said nothing. But the pattern was unmistakable now. Laura started talking about Jake more often, not in any overt or inappropriate way, but the mentions came with a different energy. "Jake's thinking of adopting a dog," she'd say one night. Or, "Jake recommended this new protein shake." It wasn't the content, it was the tone. That softness in her voice, that spark in her eyes. And then there were the glances. Whenever we were outside and Jake happened to be around, I started catching Laura sneaking little looks in his direction. Not full-on stares, but subtle. Too subtle for someone not looking for them. But I was looking now, and once you start noticing, you can't unsee it. Still, I said nothing. Maybe I was in denial. Maybe I didn't want to seem paranoid or insecure. I trusted Laura. We'd been together for years. We'd built a life. I didn't want to believe she could be drifting away. But a quieter part of me, the one gathering evidence in silence, was no longer so sure. I decided to observe. Just observe. No accusations. No fights. Just quiet vigilance. It was a Saturday morning when everything began to shift. I remember it vividly because it started so utterly normal. The kind of morning that feels unremarkable at first glance. I woke up early, the way I always did. The sun was just beginning to filter through the blinds. I made myself a coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and started scrolling through the news on my phone. Outside, the neighborhood was still waking up. And inside, something I couldn't yet name was beginning to stir. Laura was still asleep when I got up that morning. That wasn't out of the ordinary. Weekends were her time to recharge, and she always took her mornings slow. She loved lying in bed with the blinds halfway open, just enough sunlight sneaking in to remind her that the world was awake, but not enough to disturb her comfort. The house was silent except for the soft humming of the coffee machine, the occasional creak of the floor, and the faint rustling of leaves outside. For a moment, everything felt strangely peaceful. There's something cruel about those quiet moments before a storm. The false sense of calm. The illusion that life is still okay. That morning, I was sipping coffee at the kitchen table, scrolling through the news on my phone, unaware that everything was about to shift in a way I could never have anticipated. An hour later, Laura shuffled into the room. She looked every bit the picture of a lazy Saturday. Oversized pajamas, her hair tangled from sleep, phone in one hand and rubbing her eyes with the other. She mumbled a tired morning and sat across from me at the table. But something about her was off. It wasn't just her usual morning grogginess. She had this nervous energy, fidgety fingers tapping on the tabletop, her eyes darting between me and her phone, unable to settle. "You okay?" I asked, setting my phone down. She gave a quick nod, then hesitated, and slowly shook her head. "Actually, no," she said with a shaky breath. "We need to talk." That phrase, those 4 words, anyone who's been in a long-term relationship knows exactly how heavy they can be. They never mean anything casual. I felt my stomach twist in anticipation, but I tried to play it cool. "All right," I said, leaning back. "What's going on?" Laura looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle in her head, struggling to find the right words. Her eyes bounced around the room until, finally, they landed on mine. She took a breath. "I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it," she began. "I think I have feelings for Jake." Silence. For a split second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. "What?" I leaned forward, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe she meant something else. Some other Jake? A joke? Anything? But she bit her lip, guilt already etched into her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quickly, as though rushing through the confession would soften the blow. "It just happened. We've been talking, spending time. And I don't know. I feel this connection. And now I'm confused." Confused. Of all the words she could have used, that one hit me the hardest. Not sorry. Not ashamed. She was confused. Like she was stuck in some emotional crossroads, weighing me against the man next door like she was trying to pick out a new outfit. My mind raced. Was she asking for a divorce? Was this a breakup? A confession just to ease her conscience? I couldn't tell. Her expression gave me nothing concrete, just a cocktail of hesitation and nervous energy. "So what does that mean?" I finally asked. "Are you saying you're done with us?" Laura shook her head quickly. Not necessarily. I don't know what I want right now. I love you, Mike. I really do. But I can't stop thinking about him. And I need to figure out what those feelings mean before I can move forward. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Like I'd just been shoved into some alternate reality. We had built a life together. 8 years of memories, of inside jokes, of planning for the future. And now, here she was, sitting across from me in her pajamas, telling me that she might want someone else. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the surge of emotion rising in my chest. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "You want a break?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Kind of. I was thinking, maybe I could take a month, just spend some time with Jake. See if there's anything real there. If it doesn't work out, then we can come back together and work on us." I blinked, stunned. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. "You're serious?" I asked, though it wasn't really a question. Laura's eyes pleaded with mine. "I know it sounds crazy, but I don't want to throw away what we have unless I'm sure. I don't want to live with regrets." Regrets. That word echoed in my head like a hammer strike. She was talking about regrets as if she were the one risking it all. As if my heart, my dignity, our marriage, were just side casualties in her personal quest for clarity. I sat there, simmering. One part of me wanted to scream, to demand how she could be so selfish. But another part, the colder, more calculating part, chose silence. If she wanted to test the boundaries of our commitment, I would let her walk straight into the fire she lit. "All right," I said, leaning back in my chair. She blinked. "Wait, really?" "Sure," I replied with a casual shrug. "If you think that's what you need, go ahead." Her expression twisted slightly, as if she couldn't tell if I was being sincere or sarcastic. "I just think it's the best way to figure out where my heart is," she said carefully. "Sure," I repeated flatly. Do what you need to do. What she didn't know, what I didn't let on in that moment, was that the second she said she wanted to live with another man for a month, my mind flipped a switch. Emotionally, I was already gone, but I wasn't going to show my cards just yet. If she was willing to gamble everything for some fantasy across the fence, I was going to let her make her move, and I'd make mine in silence. She exhaled like I'd just given her permission to be a hero. Thank you, she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. I know it's a lot to ask, but I really believe it's the right thing. Or both of us. I pulled my hand away and stood, grabbing my coffee mug. If that's what you need, I said again, my voice devoid of emotion. Laura didn't respond. She just sat there, probably trying to process why I wasn't arguing, why I wasn't fighting to keep her. But she didn't realize I was already making plans of my own. Over the next few days, she began packing a small bag. She mentioned it casually, as if she were going away on a short business trip or a visit to a relative, not moving in with our neighbor to see if they had chemistry. She didn't even seem to notice that I wasn't asking questions. No protests, no tears, just quiet cooperation. And she mistook my silence for approval. But the day she left, I wasn't thinking about her finding clarity. I was thinking about how quickly people show you who they really are once they believe they have the upper hand. The moment Laura walked out the door, the atmosphere inside the house changed. It didn't feel empty exactly, more like someone had turned the volume down on my life. A muted hush settled over everything. I stood in the living room, watching the door swing closed behind her, the duffel bag still swinging slightly from her shoulder in my memory. I expected to feel some wave of rage or heartbreak, something intense that would knock the wind out of me. But instead, I felt calm. Not peace exactly, but a stillness. A kind of strange, silent clarity that came from no longer having to pretend. The pressure of keeping up appearances, of trying to act like everything was fine when it wasn't, that was gone. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the faucet. My wife, the woman I had shared my life with, built my home with, and imagined a future with, had just walked away to explore her confusion with Jake, our neighbor. If it hadn't been my life, I would have thought it was some outlandish drama cooked up for reality TV. The first few days passed like a dream. Not the good kind. More like the foggy aftermath of a nightmare. My body went through the motions, but my mind lagged behind. I started noticing the small things she'd left behind. Her favorite coffee mug, still sitting on the counter from that last morning. A pair of ballet flats near the front door. A throw blanket draped messily over the couch. At first I thought about tidying it all up, boxing away reminders of her. But I didn't. Not out of sentimentality, just out of sheer disinterest. I couldn't bring myself to care. I didn't miss her. Not exactly. I just didn't want to spend the energy on her anymore. So I poured myself into work, took on extra assignments, stayed late at the office, not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to go home. Coming back to that silent house felt like entering a vacuum, a space where time paused and every echo reminded me of what had been lost. Outside the office, I found a new outlet, the gym. I hadn't been big on working out before, but something about physical exertion gave me the release I needed. There was clarity in sweating it out, like I could sweat away the confusion, the anger, the betrayal. My muscles burned, my lungs strained, but with every rep and every drop of sweat, I started to feel like I was clawing back control over my own body, my own story. People began to notice changes. Friends started asking questions. Hey, where's Laura been lately? She's staying with a friend, I'd say, forcing a smile. I kept my answers vague, breezy. I wasn't ready to go public with the truth. Not yet. I needed time to process it myself. The only person I confided in was my dad. A few days after Laura left, I gave him a call. As soon as he picked up, he didn't even say hello. Just said, "What's wrong?" He's always had that kind of intuition. Even from hundreds of miles away, he could read the tone in my voice. When I told him what happened, there was a pause. A long one. Then he said, "Well, son, I hate to say it, but it sounds like you're better off." I was surprised. I'd expected more questions, more anger, more of a protective reaction. But instead, he gave me something else. Perspective. "If she doesn't know your worth," he added, "then why should you sit around waiting for her to figure it out?" Those words stayed with me. I'd been so busy picking apart Laura's behavior, wondering where I'd gone wrong, trying to pinpoint the moment everything had shifted, that I hadn't stopped to consider what I deserved. I wasn't a safety net. I wasn't a backup plan for her to run back to if her little experiment with Jake fell apart. That night I sat alone in the dark living room, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel. We looked so young in that picture, so hopeful, so certain. Now, it just felt like a snapshot from a story that had lost its way. By the end of that week, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for Laura to come home with her tail between her legs, offering apologies wrapped in confusion. I wasn't going to be a placeholder in my own marriage. The next day, I called a divorce attorney. Sitting in that office felt surreal, like I was narrating someone else's story. I explained everything, doing my best to stay composed, even as some part of me still couldn't believe this was really happening. The attorney listened carefully, nodded, then said, "You're well within your rights to file. What you're describing falls clearly under irreconcilable differences." Hearing those words, irreconcilable differences, it hit me. That's exactly what Laura and I had become. We weren't a team anymore. We didn't share the same goals, the same values, or even the same sense of loyalty. Maybe we never truly had. The lawyer walked me through the legal process, how long it might take, what forms I needed to file, and what to expect. I left that office feeling lighter, like I'd finally taken back control over the one part of my life that had felt so out of my hands. Back home, I started making quiet preparations. I opened a new bank account, not to be petty, but just in case things turned messy. I didn't want to be caught unprepared. I started mentally dividing the house. This is mine. That's hers. I didn't touch her stuff yet. I figured I'd wait until the papers were filed. But in my mind, I was already rearranging the space. Already picturing what the house would look like without her in it. The days bled into weeks, and surprisingly, I got used to it. The quiet no longer haunted me. It became a kind of freedom. I didn't have to navigate Laura's moods or walk on eggshells. I didn't have to argue about dinner or listen to her rant about things that didn't matter. I started rediscovering parts of myself that had been pushed aside to keep our relationship afloat. And then the neighborhood chatter started. A neighbor mentioned seeing Laura and Jake at the park. They looked cozy, she said, like a couple on a date. Someone else said they were spotted downtown at a cafe, sitting close, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I smiled politely, pretending it didn't bother me. But inside, I felt a wave of emotions, anger mostly, not because she was with someone else, but because of what she had thrown away, what she'd discarded so easily, like it was nothing. And beneath that anger, there was pity. Because Jake? He didn't strike me as the commitment type. He was smooth, sure, charming, attractive, but not the kind of man who sticks around when things get real. Laura was going to learn that, and she was going to learn it the hard way. I had stopped checking my phone for messages from Laura, not because I was trying to play it cool or pretend I didn't care, but because deep down, I had finally accepted the truth. If she wanted to talk, she would, but she didn't. And I wasn't going to sit around holding my breath. I was done waiting, done wondering. One night, while cleaning out the garage, I stumbled upon a dusty old box tucked away behind a stack of holiday decorations. Inside were photos, dozens of them, from the early years of our relationship. Laura and I are at the beach. Laura is laughing in the passenger seat on a road trip, our first Christmas tree. For a moment, I felt a sharp tug in my chest. We looked so young, so happy, so certain of the life we were building. But that sadness quickly gave way to something else. I thought about all the little signs I'd ignored through the years, the way she always had to be the center of attention, the way I always made sacrifices, small and large, to keep the peace. The times I put her needs ahead of mine without even realizing it, convincing myself that's just what love required. I closed the box and shoved it aside. Those memories didn't belong to the version of us that existed now. They were from a different time, from a story that no longer reflected reality. Nearly a full month had passed since Laura packed her bag and walked across the lawn to Jake's house. I'd barely heard from her during that time. A few texts, vague and distant. "Hope you're doing okay. We'll talk when I'm back." She never offered updates, never asked how I was, never showed signs of struggling with her decision. It was as if she'd already placed me in the "in case of emergency" drawer, Plan B, ready to be opened if Plan A didn't pan out. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't pacing the floor, wondering what she and Jake were doing. I wasn't imagining conversations or holding out hope. I had already filed for divorce. My attorney was drafting the paperwork. As far as I was concerned, the marriage was over. I just hadn't told Laura yet. And then, right on cue, she returned. It was almost poetic. 28 days later, as if this had been some month-long sabbatical of self-discovery. She walked through the door like nothing had happened. Her duffel bag was slung over one shoulder, hair styled. Lip gloss is perfect. That confident smile on her face, like she'd just come back from a yoga retreat and was expecting me to welcome her home. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag near the door. "I'm back." I was sitting on the couch, flipping through TV channels. I barely looked up. "Welcome back," I said, keeping my tone as flat and neutral as I could. She paused, probably expecting more, maybe a hug, or at least a question. When I didn't react, she walked over and perched, herself on the arm of the couch. "We should talk," she said, her voice softer now, cautious. I muted the TV and turned to face her, arms crossed. "All right, talk." Laura smiled, a practiced, gentle smile, the kind she used when she was trying to ease tension. "I've done a lot of thinking," she began, "and I've realized a few things, about myself, about us, about what I want." I said nothing, just nodded once, inviting her to continue. She took a deep breath, clearly preparing for some big emotional moment. "I care about you, Mike. I really do. And I think we can work through this. I think we can rebuild what we had." Rebuild. She said it like we were fixing a leaky sink, like trust and betrayal could be patched up with a fresh coat of paint and a weekend of good intentions. I didn't respond, just looked at her. She shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the silence but pushed forward. "Jake's a great guy," she added, and I had to clench my jaw to keep from laughing. The ease with which she said his name, as though he'd been a passing distraction instead of the wrecking ball she invited into our marriage. "But I realized, he's not what I need," she said. "He's fun, sure, but he's also immature. He doesn't have the kind of stability that you bring to the table. I think I just got caught up in the excitement." There it was, her revelation. She tried the shiny new toy and decided she liked the old one better. "Uh-huh," I said, my voice calm. Laura blinked, clearly thrown by my lack of reaction. "I know I've hurt you," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. "But I really believe we can get past this. We've been through so much, Mike. We have history. That's not something you just throw away." I let her finish her little speech, all the carefully chosen words she'd rehearsed on her way over. Then I stood and walked over to the kitchen. I opened a drawer, pulled out the envelope my lawyer had mailed me, and brought it back into the room. I set the stack of papers on the coffee table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, her smile fading. "Divorce papers," I said plainly. Her face went pale. "You're kidding," she said with a forced laugh. "Nope," I replied, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Not kidding." She stared at the papers like they were written in another language. Then her eyes flicked up to mine, wide with disbelief. "You're divorcing me?" Yeah, I said, voice steady. I'm not interested in being your second choice, Laura. Her expression twisted from confusion to anger in an instant. Second choice? She snapped. That's not what this is. You left, I said calmly. You walked out on our marriage to test the waters with another man. Now you're back because it didn't work out. And you want me to just forget that? To act like nothing happened? I was confused, she said, her voice shaking now. I needed time to figure things out. You thought you could have it both ways, I interrupted. You thought I'd be here waiting, grateful to have you back. She stood up, crossing her arms, defensive now. You're making a mistake, Mike. We can fix this. I know we can. I shook my head slowly. No, Laura, we can't. You made your choice. And so did I. I'm making mine. That's what I told her when she looked at me, eyes brimming with tears. But I didn't let it sway me. Not this time. I had already made up my mind, and no amount of emotion was going to rewrite what had been done. The rest of our conversation was a blur of pleas and half apologies. Laura tried to argue, tried to guilt me into changing my mind. She brought up our history, the life we'd built, the house we bought together, even the possibility of having a family one day. She threw everything she could at me, every memory, every dream we once talked about, hoping something would stick. But none of it worked. Eventually, her words ran out. Her frustration mounted. And when she realized she couldn't manipulate me into letting her back in, she stormed out of the house. The door slammed behind her like a final punctuation mark. I stood in the living room, staring at the space she had just vacated. And I felt nothing. No sorrow. No regret. No second guessing. Just a sense of calm clarity. And for the first time in what felt like ages, relief. Later that evening, I called my lawyer. He picked up on the first ring. She saw the papers, I said. How'd she take it? He asked. I smirked. Not great. Do you want to give her some time to process everything, or should we move forward? Move forward, I said without hesitation. Standing up to Laura, telling her no, drawing a line, hadn't been easy. But it was necessary. It was right. She had treated me like an option, a fallback, like she could press pause on our life together, take a detour with another man, and still expect me to be standing there, arms wide open, when she came back. If that's what she thought, she never really knew me, and I knew she wouldn't go quietly. Laura was never one to walk away from something she felt she still had a shot at, especially not when she thought she was losing. I had barely sat down when my phone buzzed again. A text from her. This isn't over. I stared at the message for a few seconds, then locked the screen and tossed the phone onto the couch. She was right. It wasn't over. Not yet. But soon. Soon enough. The next couple of days were, in a word, chaotic. The very next evening, she showed up unannounced, banging on the front door like she was trying to break it down with her fists. Mike, open the door, she yelled. I opened it, keeping my expression neutral. What do you want, Laura? She didn't answer, just pushed past me like she still lived there, like nothing had changed. She marched into the living room, arms swinging with anger. We need to talk, she said, pacing like a caged animal. You can't just file for divorce without giving me a real chance to fix things. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You had your chance, I said calmly. You made your decision the moment you left. That's not fair, she shouted. I didn't leave to end our marriage. I left to figure things out. I needed to be sure I wasn't making a mistake by staying. I let out a dry laugh. And by doing that, you proved you didn't value what we had. You don't test a marriage by running off with someone else, Laura. That's not how this works. She stopped pacing, turned to face me. Her eyes were red, part anger, part exhaustion. She looked like she hadn't slept much. I was confused, she said, voice cracking. I didn't know what I wanted, but I know now. I want us, Mike. I want to fix this. Too late, I said, my tone unyielding. You don't get to come back now just because Jake didn't turn out to be what you expected. Her face contorted with frustration. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You're being petty," she snapped. "You're throwing away everything we built over one mistake." I shook my head slowly. "It wasn't one mistake, Laura. It was a series of choices. You chose to flirt with him. You chose to emotionally invest in him. You chose to leave. Those weren't slip-ups. Those were decisions. And decisions have consequences." She opened her mouth to argue again, but stopped. Her shoulders dropped. Something in her seemed to break. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked quietly. I sighed. For a brief second, I felt pity. Even after everything, it was hard not to feel something for the woman I once loved. But I couldn't let that emotion undo everything I'd worked so hard to reclaim. "That's not my problem anymore," I said. "You made your choices. Now you live with them." She stood there, frozen. For a moment, I thought she might cry again. Say something else. Try one last time. But she didn't. She just turned around and walked out. No door slam this time. Just quiet footsteps fading into the evening. After that, the divorce process moved quickly. Laura did her best to stall at first, probably hoping I'd have a change of heart. She even tried painting herself as the victim to our mutual friend, saying I was cold, distant, and unforgiving. But I didn't waver, and neither did my dad. When I updated him on everything, he let out a low whistle. "She's got some nerve," he said, "but I'm proud of you, son. Standing your ground? That takes guts." Laura's efforts didn't get her far. My lawyer was sharp, and the facts were simple. She had voluntarily walked away from the marriage. She had chosen Jake. That didn't leave a lot of room for sympathy. She even tried to claim spousal support, said she'd sacrificed her career for our relationship. But the judge didn't buy it. In the end, we reached a fair settlement. She got a modest amount of money and a few pieces of furniture she'd picked out. But I kept the house, my savings, and, more importantly, my peace. The final court date was surreal. Sitting in that courtroom, pen in hand, preparing to sign away a marriage that had once meant everything to me. It felt strange. Not painful, not heartbreaking, just surreal. Like I was watching it happen from outside my body. I glanced over at Laura a couple of times. She looked tired, hollow. Her lawyer handed her a pen, and for a moment she hesitated. But eventually, she signed her name at the bottom of the page, just like I did. And just like that, it was done. Outside the courtroom, she approached me in the hallway. "Mike," she said softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for everything." I nodded once. "I know," I said. Then I turned and walked away. I looked at her for a long moment, searching her face, searching for some trace of the woman I had once fallen in love with. But the more I looked, the more I realized that person wasn't there anymore. All I saw standing in front of me was someone I used to know, a ghost of what once was. "I know you're sorry," I said quietly, "but sorry doesn't fix this." Her eyes shimmered with tears. She looked like she was about to say something, maybe reach for a final plea. She raised her arm slightly, as if hoping for a hug, for forgiveness. But I took a step back. "Take care of yourself, Laura," I said, my voice steady, and then I turned and walked away. After that day, I didn't hear from her directly again, but every now and then, little pieces of her life drifted to me through mutual friends or the occasional neighborhood whisper. I heard that Jake had moved on fairly quickly, not long after she came back and found the door closed. He had already set his sights on someone else. Typical. Laura, meanwhile, was staying with a relative, trying, as one friend put it, to figure things out. Again. I didn't feel smug when I heard that. I didn't feel pity either. I just felt nothing. She made her choices, and now, like all choices, they came with consequences. One afternoon, I ran into her at the grocery store. I was grabbing coffee beans. She was in the next aisle with a half-empty cart. We locked eyes for a split second. The guilt on her face was unmistakable. She gave me a small, uncertain wave. I just nodded and kept walking. There was nothing left to say. Looking back, I don't regret a thing. Laura believed she could leave, explore her feelings, and come back when it suited her. But life doesn't work that way. People aren't spare tires. I've learned a lot about myself through all of this. I know now I deserve someone who sees my worth, who chooses me, and only me. And if that person's out there, great. If not, that's fine too. Right now, I'm rebuilding, and I'm doing it on my own terms.